What was Friedrich Nietzsche trying to say when he said that, quote, God is dead? And why, contrary to popular belief, was he actually terrified by the so-called death of God? Hello, hello. My name is Derek Coe, and welcome to the Secular Monastic, where we explore all things related to spirituality and religion. No supernatural beliefs required. And today we are going to be talking about what is probably the most misunderstood quote of all time on the topic of religion from one of the most misunderstood philosophers of all time, Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's God is dead quote is so widely misunderstood that it has inspired an entire film series, an entire cinematic universe, if you will. And that gives us a pretty good starting point, because before talking more about what Nietzsche meant when he said that God is dead, I think it's worth it to talk about what people, particularly evangelical Christians in America and the West more broadly, but also just theistic religious people of all different varieties, have mistakenly thought that he meant. And the camp of lay religious people have popularly interpreted this quote out of context as Nietzsche being this atheistic, nihilistic philosopher who hated Christians and hated Christianity, kind of triumphantly declaring that God is dead and celebrating what he sees as modern thought and science's victory over the old superstitions and religions that bound people to a belief in God. Now, this reading is mistaken and a misinterpretation, yes, but it's complicated by the fact that there are some kernels of truth embedded in it. First and foremost, yes, Friedrich Nietzsche was an atheist, and yes, he very much disliked Christianity, at least as it was practiced by most Christians of his time. But his atheism and his critique of Christianity was far more nuanced than most Christians today would give him credit for, as we will kind of explore later in the episode. Secondly, Nietzsche's tone when pronouncing the death of God was not one of joy and celebration, but rather one of fear and trembling and anxiety. And to illustrate that, we need only to read his full quote in context. It's funny how useful that can be in actually understanding what people are trying to say, right? It reads, quote, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? End quote. Now, I don't know about you, but to me that does not sound like somebody who is cheerfully and triumphantly announcing the death of God. And to understand what Nietzsche was trying to say, it's helpful to provide some cultural and historical background. Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Prussia, which is now part of Germany, to his mother, who was a former teacher, and his father, who was a Lutheran minister. He attended a private boys' school as a child, and academic records show that while he wasn't top of his class in every subject, he did excel in classes on Christian theology, probably partly due to his father's profession, and because he was the son of a pastor who was employed by the government. Remember, there was no separation of church and state back then. The Prussian state granted him a scholarship at a prestigious boarding school, where he continued his education and even got a grounding in several different languages like Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and French, which allowed him to read many primary sources for classical works and even early church writings and scripture. And he eventually majored in theology and philology, the latter being the study of establishing the wording and context of historical texts. So looking at what historical texts are rather than what they're saying, and interpreting them, which is a separate field, the field of hermeneutics. And he studied this at the University of Bonn in hopes of eventually following his father's footsteps and becoming a minister himself. But as fate would have it, this was not to be. And within one semester of academic study, he lost his faith, much to the dismay of his mother. And by 1865, just a year after he entered university, he wrote his sister, who remained religious, about his deconversion in a letter that contained this quote. Quote, "Hence the ways of men part. If you wish to strive for peace of the soul and pleasure, then believe. If you wish to be a devotee of truth, then inquire. And honestly, what a relatable experience. It took me about 3 years in college before I left my own Christian faith and disappointed my own family, but there are just so many parts of Nietzsche's upbringing, education, and journey that are so deeply relatable, and relatable to all people who kind of relentlessly seek truth, even past the point that it serves our own individual happiness, and in fact might even start to impede our own individual happiness. We see from the quote in that letter to his sister that Nietzsche understood by the time he was 20 years old that false beliefs can bring a sense of peace and comfort while seeking truth at all costs might cause you to lose some of those things. And while I've joked a bit about losing faith in university, it should be said that ministers of the time, and especially ministers employed by the state, had to go through rigorous university educations and be educated in multiple languages in order to be a religious leader. There weren't any American-style one-year evangelical seminaries in in the 1800s in Prussia. There were no Joel Osteens, studying communications at university before dropping out and leading a mega church of thousands without even getting a degree in theology or biblical studies. And I mean, seriously, guys, like, not to pick on Joel Osteen in particular, but the U.S. religious landscape, especially outside of these like established mainline Protestant denominations, or the Catholic Church, or the Orthodox Church, these traditions with kind of rigorous seminary training. The America is kind of dotted with ministers that have not deeply studied theological debates or philosophy and might not have even just deeply studied the Bible itself. But historically, that sort of education was needed to go into ministry. There are many highly educated and highly intelligent people, past and present, who remain incredibly religious, whether they go into ministry or not. But what set Nietzsche apart, and what has us discussing his philosophy to this day, is that he was never going to be the kind of person who was satisfied with any beliefs he was simply taught by his family or by his society. Most people, of course, have as part of their beliefs and knowledge things that they need to seek out for themselves and understand for themselves and learn for themselves. But it is not hard to see that a lot of other beliefs, whether they be political or religious or cultural, are the kinds of things that people simply adopt from those who raised them or those who live around them. But Nietzsche was not somebody who could do this, even if he could see that one could be happier doing so. More than that, Nietzsche was not going to be satisfied by even sophisticated theology and nuanced interpretations of scripture that he personally found fulfilling or emotionally resonant. He needed to get to the truth. And this dovetails really nicely into his pronouncement of the death of God and the context in which it happened. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published in 1859, and Nietzsche did learn about the theory of evolution and accepted most of its scientific claims. He had a complicated relationship with Darwinism and a complex view of Darwinism, but if you read about his more negative attitudes towards Darwinism, they were driven almost by a dismay and a romantic kind of like philosophical view that found evolution to be this harsh mechanical system and theory of life that disregarded too much of what he saw as the human will and what it could influence. And that's too much to get into here, but at the end of the day, he recognized the profundity and importance of Darwin's discoveries and achievements and thought that his scientific claims were basically true. German Protestant theology of the period was also beginning to wrestle with so-called higher criticism as an approach to reading scripture. This approach saw the Bible not as one divinely dictated, infallible text, but as something that required reworking and reinterpretation to fit with scientific and also archaeological and historical discoveries. David Strauss, a German Protestant theologian, was one of the first minds in Europe to investigate Jesus as a historical figure and posit that certain stories in the Gospels were fabrications to make Jesus look more like the Jewish Messiah, fulfilling Old Testament prophecies. He wrote about this in his well-known work, The Life of Jesus, which was published in 1835. And it definitely caused an uproar at the time, but 30 years later, by the time Nietzsche entered university, and read this work, it had become a deeply ingrained topic of discussion in German seminaries and universities, which really pioneered the critical historical approach to interpreting the Bible that many mainline liberal denominations of Christianity in the US, like Episcopalians and liberal Lutherans, still use to this day. And there's much more to say about the context in which Nietzsche lost his Christian faith, but suffice it to say, he eventually came to the conclusion that, look, Christianity and the Bible, as it has been taught for hundreds of years, might have been plausible in the past, but now by the year of our Lord, 1865, it had become almost impossible for an educated, modern person who thinks critically and unabashedly seeks truth to really believe wholeheartedly in Christianity or even in God. And you can disagree with that opinion, but it was Nietzsche's honest opinion and the opinion of a growing number of people in his time, and arguably a growing number of people even today. That is the core of what Nietzsche is saying. When he says that God is dead and we have killed him, he is not talking about the literal murder of a divine deity who actually exists. Remember, he's an atheist. He is saying that through scientific and philosophical advancement, through explorations of archaeology and history, and through critical scholarship of the Bible, among other things, humanity since the Enlightenment had basically gotten itself to a place in which God had basically died for most reasonable people. That is, reasonable people who seek truth could no longer truly believe, and what's more, he was terrified by what this meant because think about his educational and family and cultural background. Nietzsche was very aware that for over 1,000 years, people in Germany and European society more broadly had grounded essential components of society and human existence in these religious stories and doctrines and governed them with religious institutions. Claims to objective morality or even objective truth in general were grounded in the church's teachings and in religion, and even more than that, they were grounded at the base in faith in the wisdom of the Christian God. This is what terrified Nietzsche. Nietzsche was scared to death of the fact that the metaphysical foundations of people's beliefs about the world and about morality and about the meaning of their lives were crumbling under the weight of human discoveries about the world, and what he saw flooding into the vacuum was nihilism, a philosophy which sees life as meaningless, sees morality as an illusion, and which sometimes sees even objective truth and knowledge as unobtainable or unknowable for mere humans. That last one might sound odd to people, but if you're familiar with René Descartes' famous pronouncement, I think, therefore I am, you'll be familiar with this because Descartes eventually concluded that knowledge of the existence of one's own mind was the only truth we could be sure of through pure reasoning, and that everything else we know about the physical world could simply be an illusion or deception, or for more modern iterations, kind of a simulation, and we could simply be brains in a jar, like Matrix style. It's not surprising to me at all that Descartes was a devout Catholic and remained one even after doing his most famous philosophical work, because he understood, perhaps before anyone who at least wrote these ideas down, that without an ability to ground truth and knowledge, there is very little that as mere mortal human beings with our fallible senses can even be sure that we know. And so nihilism seems very bleak on the surface, but it is hard to argue against coming from a purely atheistic and rationalistic worldview. Now, maybe all of this is still a little too abstract. And maybe it's still a little hard to see where Nietzsche was coming from. Chillax, Nietzsche, we might be tempted to say. Sure, Jesus might not have been born on Christmas, but create your own meaning and then go home and spend the holidays with your family anyway. Enjoy a slice of pumpkin pie, even if you're not sure if that slice of pumpkin pie is even real. Drink a cup of eggnog and just take a chill pill. Things aren't so dire. It's a common reaction people have to this kind of existential dread, and as usual, I truly wish it was this simple. To demonstrate where Nietzsche's head must have been at, let's say another core part of human life failed on that same scale. What's a problem that humanity has had to solve since it has existed? Well, how about how to move and store drinking water? humans have had to store and transport drinking water for as long as they've existed. And as early as 30,000 years ago, we have evidence of the oldest pottery. And before that, humans made do with containers made of bone or animal skins, or even baskets woven so tightly from grasses and reeds that they were actually watertight and could hold liquid. And of course, from the aqueducts that the Romans built to modern reservoirs and water towers and pipelines and even just plastic and metal cans and water bottles we have today, we have continued to improve the ways in which we can store and transport drinking water. Now, what would happen if you woke up tomorrow and all of the technology that humans had ever invented to store and transport drinking water suddenly broke or stopped working? Well, I would hope it rains a lot where you live. Or that you're near kind of like an alpine lake or a pristine river or glacier. Kidding aside, it's not hard to see why this would quickly become a massive problem everywhere, and or at least almost everywhere. And what's another problem that all humans have had to face at some point? Well, everyone has at some point needed to figure out why some things are more important than others, why some actions are evil and some are good, and what purpose their life serves that is worth enduring life's difficulties for. Nietzsche was terrified because with the death of God and the fall of religious faith, humanity had lost the essential tools needed to create a system of meaning and value, which is a core part of human existence, whether you're aware of it or not. And listen, I wished the human response to nihilism and all of the meaninglessness and chaos that comes with it was truly as simple as spending Christmas by the fireplace with your family, eating gingerbread cookies, and finding a hobby to do on the weekends. But Nietzsche deeply understood that humans simply do not live easily in a state of nihilism. The stakes of life are just too high for that. You may well be aware, enlightened viewer, that nothing has inherent meaning and value, but just see how you respond to, say, your spouse cheating on you, maybe with some handsome foreign coworker who is here on a work visa. Would it matter to you that you no longer believe that adultery is a sin against a God that you don't even believe in? I would bet a lot of money that your response would not be, oh, well, I shouldn't value the fidelity of my husband or wife, all the value I assign to the trust we have between us and the romance that we have. None of that is really real or objective, so who cares? In fact, I'm pretty sure that if your friend had that sort of a response to their spouse cheating on them, you would be a little concerned and you would try to see if they're, mentally well. And I would also bet that depending on how liberal or right wing your political sensibilities are, you might want society and the government to value the fidelity of your marriage so much that it either allows you to divorce your spouse without paying alimony, or on the really extreme end, that it deports your handsome foreign coworker to some extrajudicial prison in El Salvador, just a random example I'm throwing out there, or even recriminalizes adultery and actually throws people in prison for it. And if you think that this can't happen in the 21st century, Indonesia just recriminalized adultery a couple years ago in 2023. And similarly, if a thief stole your car, I doubt very much that you're understanding that thou shalt not steal is not a divine commandment coming straight from God will be of much comfort to you. In fact, I would very confidently assume that you would at the very least want the thief caught and to face some consequences and possibly even go through some process of rehabilitation. On the very extreme end, you might even want him locked in prison for life or even executed. And I sincerely hope nobody listening is that extreme. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that what we choose to fill the vacuum of nihilism with in a post-God world matters. And importantly, Nietzsche just was not very optimistic about the ability of most people to do this. The act of rebuilding a robust system of meaning and value, brick by brick, after the old God-based systems are burned to the ground, was just too difficult to most people. At least the way Nietzsche saw it. And as a result of this viewpoint, he predicted that other systems of belief would come flooding into the vacuum left by God-based beliefs. and religion to provide meaning and values that people crave. Now, I did mention at the start of the episode that Nietzsche disliked Christianity, at least as it was practiced by most Christians of the time, and this is a really good time to kind of revisit that. Why, you might ask, would Nietzsche simultaneously fear the death of God and also have this disdain for Christian values and practices? It's too much to cover fully in this episode, but Nietzsche basically saw Christian morality as a kind of slave morality, which is to be contrasted with what he saw as master morality. And look, these are problematic terms with that are problematic in a modern context, but just to quickly define them, master morality was the name that he gave to the kind of value system that greater men and women could build and pursue for themselves in a way that most people could not. Whereas slave morality, as Nietzsche defined it, pointed to a way of seeing the world that was mostly focused on coping with existing circumstances without changing them. So, some examples might be helpful here. Under Christian morality, Nietzsche would say that, not being able to find sexual partners becomes the virtue of chastity. And needing to wait for the things that you want or you need becomes the virtue of patience. And if you were a weak and powerless person, rather than aspiring to power, Christianity tells you, don't you worry your pretty little head. The meek shall inherit the earth, and the first shall be last, and the last shall be first one day. Nietzsche thought that this kind of worldview stifled human potential and the human will to power in a way that was just actively harmful and obstructive to the project of living in a meaningful, authentic, and worthwhile life for the individual. Rather than seeing weakness as something to overcome, Christian slave morality, in his view, almost fetishized weakness and turned it into a virtue. And just to be clear, Nietzsche would not point to an aid worker or social worker helping people afflicted by life difficulties or natural disasters who, never made more than 30,000 a year as somebody who is automatically weak and automatically an adherent to slave morality. To Nietzsche, it's all about your mindset. If that aid worker's true heart's desire and authentic value system points them towards the kind of work that helps the downtrodden through sacrifice, they can be as much of an Ubermensch as anyone else, and as much a practitioner of master morality as anybody else. But say this person goes and works for an NGO making far less money than they want, only because they failed their interview at Google or McKinsey or BlackRock out of college, and they therefore kind of never achieved their true dream of being a millionaire by the age of 30, and all these years they have simply been coping with the loss of a path to that sort of upper middle class life by thinking about the virtue of the path that they chose simply probably because it was the best option that they had. They might even post on social media a ton about how working for big tech companies or banks or consulting firms is evil, while extolling their own virtues, all while secretly wishing for the kind of wealth and lifestyle that employment at these sorts of companies would be able to afford them. Whatever your thoughts on the ethics of working for large corporations is, we can at least agree that this mindset and this kind of life philosophy, defined by impotence and resentment against those who have what one wants, is not a recipe for self-actualization or life fulfillment. Now, that's just the way that Christian morality can trap and limit the individual, but is Christianity the only way one can be trapped in slave morality? Well, clearly not, and Nietzsche didn't think so either. What other things do we take comfort in choosing, even if they weren't choices we ever made? Well, what about the nation we were born in and being proud of that? What about the religion or economic class of our parents, or of the family that we were born to? And in some of the most toxic variants, what about the ethnicity we were born as, or the racial group that we were born into? Is it possible for somebody to be motivated by resentment and through identifying with all these different categories, even if it doesn't point to any great individual achievement or any individual overcoming of one's own weaknesses? Clearly that is possible, right? And there are many, many examples. On the more political kind of economic class interest end of things, is it possible for a communist or a socialist to be motivated primarily by resentment against the rich or the capitalist class in their politics? And is it possible for them to extol and romanticize the virtues of the working class and the proletariat while demonizing the bourgeoisie simply because they were born into the working class and want to cope with a situation of powerlessness and poverty that they don't believe they can change? And is it possible for somebody to kind of, identify as a communist and socialist and a revolutionary, all while truly kind of like secretly like aspiring to an upper middle class or bourgeois life? Clearly, yes. And there are many examples throughout history, of communist and socialist movements that have been motivated by this sort of like resentment, that have unfortunately produced really, really terrible results. Consider another category. Consider nationalists. Is it possible for somebody to identify with their own country and resent those outside of their nation? And consider the most toxic variant of this, fascism and white ethno-nationalism, or really just ethno-nationalism in general, of any stripe. Is it possible for somebody to identify with their own race or ethnicity and resent those of other races, ethnicities, and even religions, for what they are perceived to have or to control, or what they are perceived to kind of like take from the true kind of ethnicity of the nation, or the true kind of like, true citizens of the nation as is defined by some of these ethno-nationalists? Is it possible for them to resent these people of different ethnicities, even if they are friends and neighbors who are citizens of the same country that they inhabit? Nietzsche would have seen all of these resentment-motivated ideologies as nonsense, which thwarted human potential and self-actualization, but he had a special disdain for German nationalists and anti-Semites of the time, even breaking from his Nazi-sympathizing sister and his former friend, the composer and avowed anti-Semite Richard Wagner, over it. He even was quoted once as saying that Germany would do well to deport anti-Semites instead of Jews, and more than that, he saw ethno-nationalism as herd mentality and a crude form of collectivism that was an obstacle to all that was good about European culture and individualism. He, funnily enough, advocated mixed marriages, including between Jews and Europeans, as part of the solution to what he saw as base fetishization of ethnic and national identity and all the barbarism that could come with that. And while his, solutions were orthodox and not exactly feasible and a little bit reminiscent of like, high school redditors, thoughts that they that they think are deep, it's not exactly hard to understand where he was coming from, given the environment that he must have been writing in 1880s Germany. Look at everything that has happened since he died in 1900. From the mass murders and genocides of fascist governments in Italy, Germany, and Japan, to the deaths of millions in Stalin's gulags, Mao's, Laogai, and the killing fields of Pol Pot. Nietzsche feared the death of God, not because he liked Christianity or thought that there was nothing wrong with the old systems of value and meaning that theistic religions created. What he realized instead was that humans have no shortage of ability to create new religions of resentment that could be even more unconstrained, barbaric, and deadly than the God-centered beliefs of the past. In my opinion, given all the history we have to look back on, all of us, atheists and believers alike, can afford to be more on guard against where a morality of resentment can lead us. It's easy, I think, for atheists and secular people to think of themselves as immune to this kind of barbaric herd mentality just because they've shed religious and supernatural beliefs. But if you look at the atrocities of the 20th century and even atrocities of the 21st century, like the Rwandan genocide in which Catholics killed fellow Catholics just because they were of a different ethnic group, it's clear that while religion can motivate violence, it can also be a uniting force. And what's more, it's far from the only ideology or even really the worst ideology that can motivate violence. If there's one thing I would love for those listening to take away from Nietzsche's thoughts on the death of God, it's to beware the new religions of violence that exist in our modern world, and to beware the slave morality of new ideologies of violence. And that's whether they are based on ethnic hatred, economic resentment, or a misguided sense of national pride. And here I'm going to throw in a caveat and say that, of course, it is possible to be proud of certain aspects of your nation. It is possible to kind of center the interests of the working class and, build a politics around uplifting the working class and providing for all members of society. It is possible to kind of like have all of these beliefs, besides maybe the ethnic hatred. That's bad in any context, but it's possible to hold some version of, some of these beliefs without being motivated by an ideology of resentment. But what Nietzsche really saw was that it is really, really difficult for the average person to adopt some of these beliefs without adopting a version that was motivated by resentment and motivated by a politics of resentment that would lead to violence. He foresaw the political religions of the 20th century and probably even the kind of like ethno-nationalism that dominated the 20th century and has even carried into the 21st, unfortunately, and into our modern day. We have many, many examples to point to, especially over the last 10 years. And if there's one thing I want you to take away, it's that no group, no ethnic group, no religious group, no political camp is truly immune from this kind of politics, or the ideologies of kind of like violence that they can motivate and lead to. Much more to say about Nietzsche's thoughts on religion and his philosophy in general, but thank you for tuning in. Till next time. Bye.